You think you belong here, darling? How amusing.
Look at her, trying so desperately to buy her way into a world she'll never belong to. The words, dripping with the casual cruelty of old money, were spoken by Beatrice Devington, a woman whose diamonds were as cold as her heart. The target of her scorn was Seraphina Hayes, a black woman in a stunning but simple gown who had just outbid her at a high-stakes charity auction. The gilded ballroom, filled with Boston's elite, erupted in a wave of sycophantic laughter as the Devington family circled their prey, their smiles like polished knives. They saw a social climber, an upstart to be put in her place. What they didn't see was the unnerving calm in Seraphina's eyes, not the look of someone shamed, but the predatory stillness of a lioness who had just chosen her kill. They had no idea that the woman they were trying to humiliate was the very person who held the fate of their crumbling empire in her hands, and she had just decided to crush it. The air in the Grand Heritage Ballroom was thick with the scent of money, a heady mix of expensive perfume, aged scotch, and the faint, papery smell of generational wealth. It was the annual Boston Heritage Gala, an event where the city's oldest families gathered to congratulate each other on their good fortune under the guise of charity. Towering floral arrangements bled color onto white linen tablecloths, and the light from a dozen crystal chandeliers fractured into a million glittering diamonds on the polished marble floor. Seraphina, Sera Hayes, sat at a table near the back, a deliberate choice. From here, she could observe the entire ecosystem. She watched the way power moved through the room, a nod between bankers, a whispered confidence between a shipping magnate and a politician, the subtle, dismissive wave of a hand that could seal or shatter a career. She was a hunter in a gilded jungle, and tonight she was studying her prey. Her focus was on Table 1, the throne room, where the Devington family held court. Richard Devington, the patriarch, held the glass of scotch, his face a mask of bored, unshakable confidence. He was the king of a threadbare empire, Devington Textiles, a company Sera knew was bleeding money, its legacy being eaten alive by its owner's refusal to adapt. Beside him was his son, Julian, a pale imitation of his father, his eyes darting around the room, constantly seeking approval. And then there was Beatrice. Beatrice Devington was the queen. Clad in a gown the color of blood, her neck and wrists encrusted with jewels that had been in her family for a century, she ruled the room with a gaze that could freeze champagne. Her power wasn't in business, it was in bloodlines, in the brutal, unspoken rules of who belonged and who did not. The final auction item of the night was presented, a small, breathtaking landscape painting by a forgotten 19th-century artist, the very first piece of art the original Devington patriarch had ever purchased. It was a piece of their history, a symbol of their legacy, which Richard was now selling off to secretly plug another hole in his sinking financial ship.
The bidding started at a respectable $50,000. It climbed quickly. 100,000. 200. The room buzzed, the display of wealth a spectator's sport. Finally, only two bidders remained. Beatrice Devington, bidding to buy back her own family's legacy, and the quiet, unknown black woman at the back of the room. $300,000. Beatrice called out, her voice ringing with the finality of a queen making a decree. A satisfied silence fell over the room. She smiled, victorious. 350,000, Sera said, her voice calm and clear, not lifting a paddle, but simply catching the auctioneer's eye. A collective gasp went through the ballroom. Heads swiveled. Who was this woman? Beatrice's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. She saw Sera's simple, elegant black gown not as understated class, but as an off-the-rack imitation. She saw her quiet confidence as brazen audacity. "For 100,000, Beatrice snapped, her voice now sharp. "500,000, Sera replied without missing a beat. Beatrice's face hardened. This was no longer about a painting, it was about status. This upstart, this nobody, was challenging her in her own house, in front of her own people. $1,000,000, Beatrice declared, throwing the number down like a gauntlet. The room erupted in applause. It was a magnificent, absurd overbid, a power play designed to crush her opponent and cement her dominance. She looked toward Sera with a triumphant, dismissive sneer. The auctioneer, stunned but thrilled, turned to Sera. "Ma'am, the bid is $1,000,000. Sera met his gaze, then let her own sweep slowly across the room, past the gloating faces of the Devingtons, and back to the stage. $2,000,000, she said, her voice as soft as silk, but the impact was like a physical blow. The applause died instantly. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with disbelief. Beatrice's face went from flushed with pride to white with fury. She was being made a fool of. She opened her mouth to counter, but Richard, his face pale with the sudden, sick realization of their financial reality, put a restraining hand on her arm. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. They couldn't afford it. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking through the silence. "To the lady at table 22. It was in that moment, in the stinging public defeat, that Beatrice's refined cruelty curdled into raw, venomous hate. As the applause for Sera began, thin and hesitant, Beatrice's voice sliced through the air. And that's when she said it. Look at her, trying so desperately to buy her way into a world she'll never belong to. The room fell silent again, then erupted in a different sound, the ugly, sycophantic laughter of people who knew which queen to bow to. Sera remained seated, her face a perfect, unreadable mask, as the Devington family rose and approached her table, their smiles like polished knives. "My dear," Beatrice began, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "you must understand. Some things, history, legacy, blood, simply cannot be bought. You may have the painting, but you will never have what it represents." Richard Devington chuckled condescendingly. "Probably just a bit of new money excitement. Don't worry, it'll wear off when you realize you have to pay for it." Sera didn't speak. She simply met their gaze, her eyes unnervingly calm. It was not the look of a woman who had been shamed. It was the predatory stillness of a lioness who had just chosen her kill. In that moment, with their laughter echoing around her, she made a decision. The friendly acquisition she had planned was off the table. This was no longer business. It was justice. Have you ever witnessed someone being publicly shamed for not fitting in? What emotions did it stir in you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Seraphina Hayes did not wait for the self-congratulatory speeches to end. She signed the necessary paperwork for the painting, her signature a sharp, decisive slash of ink, and walked out of the Grand Heritage Ballroom without a backward glance. The sycophantic laughter of Boston's elite faded behind her, replaced by the crisp, cold air of the city night. As her driver pulled the discreet town car away from the curb, she looked not at the glittering skyline, but at her own reflection in the darkened window. For a moment, the powerful woman in the elegant black gown was gone. In her place, she saw the ghost of a 16-year-old girl, standing in the rain, watching men in suits put a padlock on the door of her father's dream. To understand the cold, surgical precision with which Sera was about to dismantle the house of Devington, you had to understand the ashes she had risen from. Her father, Marcus Hayes, was a master tailor, a man who didn't just sew clothes, he wove stories. His small shop, the Hayes Haberdashery, was a neighborhood institution, a place that smelled of warm wool, cedar, and ambition. He had built it from nothing, his calloused fingers creating bespoke suits that made ordinary men feel like kings. It was his art, his passion, his legacy. When Sera was 16, a corporate behemoth, a textile giant not unlike Devington's, moved into the city. They didn't compete, they suffocated. They undercut his prices, stole his designs, and bled his suppliers dry with ruthless exclusivity contracts. Her father fought, pouring every dollar, every ounce of his soul, into the battle. He believed in the simple, honest power of quality. But he was a craftsman in a world that had begun to worship speed and greed. Sera remembered the day the bank foreclosed. It wasn't a dramatic showdown. It was a quiet gray Tuesday. Two men in ill-fitting suits, their faces impassive, hammered a foreclosure notice to the door he had so proudly painted himself. They locked it, and the sound of the bolt sliding home was the sound of her father's spirit breaking. He was never the same. The light in his eyes dimmed, and the hands that had once created such beauty grew still. He died 2 years later, not of any specific illness, but of a shattered heart. On that rainy day, watching the padlock go on the door, 16-year-old Sera made a vow. She would not be broken. She would learn the language of the men in suits, and she would become a predator in their world, a world that had devoured her family whole. That vow had forged her into Nightfall. She devoured books on finance, on corporate law, on hostile takeovers. She had learned that in the world of high finance, morality was a liability, and a perceived weakness was an invitation to attack. She didn't build companies, she stalked them. She found the bloated, arrogant legacy corporations, the ones coasting on a name built by their grandfathers, and she exposed their rot, buying them up, stripping them of their corrupt leadership, and restructuring them into something stronger, leaner. Every victory was a silent tribute to her father. She wasn't just acquiring assets, she was avenging him, one broken boardroom at a time. And the Devingtons were the perfect prey. From the outside, Devington Textiles was an institution, a thread woven into the very fabric of Boston's history. For over a century, their name had been synonymous with quality and American craftsmanship. Their factories had supplied the wool for army uniforms in 2 world wars. Their iconic logo was a symbol of enduring old money power. But inside the boardroom, the empire was threadbare. Richard Devington, who had inherited the company 30 years ago, was a man who worshipped the past. He saw the company not as a living, evolving business, but as a museum to his family's greatness. He had sneered at globalization, scoffed at automation, and considered e-commerce a vulgar trend for the lower classes. While the rest of the world innovated, Richard hosted lavish parties and gave speeches about the Devington legacy. He had funneled company money into his son Julian's disastrous vanity projects, a failed art gallery, a boutique hotel that was empty for a year before it closed, a line of designer polo shirts that nobody bought. He had ignored the warnings from his accountants, the pleas from his board. He was Richard Devington, and Devingtons did not fail. But they were failing. Spectacularly. The company was drowning in debt, its factories were inefficient, and its market share had dwindled to almost nothing. The sale of the painting tonight wasn't a charitable act. It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to make payroll next month. Richard was a king presiding over a mountain of debt, a facade of wealth that was one strong gust of wind away from collapsing into dust. His wife, Beatrice, knew none of the specifics, but she felt the chill of impending irrelevance in her bones. Her entire identity was predicated on being a Devington, on the power that name afforded her. Her cruelty, the very public humiliation of Seraphina Hayes, was not the act of a confident queen. It was the panicked, vicious lashing out of a woman terrified of losing her place at the top of the food chain. She was defending a kingdom that had already secretly fallen. They were a house of cards, and they had just invited a hurricane to dinner. As Sera's car sped through the Boston night, she wasn't thinking about the $2 million painting she had just bought. She was thinking about the look on Beatrice's face. It was the same look of cold, dismissive superiority she had seen on the faces of the men who had destroyed her father. She pulled out her phone, not the encrypted satellite device, but a simple burner. She dialed a number. A crisp, professional voice answered on the first ring. "Nightfall," the voice said. It was a statement, not a question. "The friendly acquisition of Devington Textiles is off," Sera said, her voice a sliver of ice. "Execute protocol Chimera. At market open tomorrow. I want a controlling interest by noon." There was a half-second of silence on the other end, the only acknowledgement of the stunning shift in plans. "Understood. Are there any new parameters?" Sera's mind flashed back to Beatrice's sneering face, to the mocking laughter of the crowd. "Yes," she replied, her voice dangerously quiet. "The offer is to be 50 cents on the dollar. And when we are done, I want the Devington family to have nothing. Not the company. Not their board seats. Nothing. It will be done," the voice said, and the line went dead. Sera looked back out the window. She had come to the auction tonight to close a chapter, to make a strategic, if somewhat sentimental, acquisition. But the Devingtons had reminded her of who she was, and why she had started this crusade in the first place. This was no longer just another takeover. It was a homecoming. What drives a person more? The ambition to build something new, or the need to avenge a past wrong? Share your thoughts on what you think fuels Seraphina in the comments below. While Seraphina Hayes was setting a corporate empire ablaze with a single phone call, the Devington family was retreating to their ancestral mansion in Beacon Hill, utterly oblivious to the architect of their ruin. The ride home was a symphony of fury. Beatrice was incandescent with rage, her earlier performance of aristocratic poise having dissolved into a torrent of venomous complaints about the appalling nerve of the woman who had publicly bested her. Julian eagerly agreed, adding his own snide remarks about new money trash. Only Richard Devington was silent. He stared out the window at the passing city lights, his mind a maelstrom of fear. The auction had been a failure. The $2 million for the painting was a spectacular figure, but it was a drop of water in the vast, arid desert of his debt. It wouldn't even cover the interest payment due next week. His public bravado was a carefully constructed mask, and behind it, he was a terrified man watching the legacy of a century crumble in his hands. "Richard, are you even listening to me?" Beatrice snapped, her voice pulling him from his dark thoughts. "We must find out who that woman was. I'll have her blacklisted from every event in this city. She will never show her face in Boston society again." Richard just nodded wearily. "Of course, my dear." He didn't have the heart to tell her that in a matter of weeks, they might be the ones blacklisted, their own names a synonym for failure. Their only hope, their single desperate lifeline, was a mysterious entity known only as Nightfall. For the past 6 months, Richard had been in frantic, indirect negotiations with this notoriously private investment group. Nightfall was a legend in the financial world, a ghost that materialized only to devour or revitalize vulnerable companies. They were known for their silence, their speed, and their seemingly infinite resources. They had made an offer to acquire Devington Textiles, a generous offer that felt less like a business deal and more like divine intervention. It was enough to wipe out all their debt, modernize their factories, and secure the Devington name for another generation. The deal was everything. Richard had been praying for it, staking the entire future of his family on the whims of an investor he had never met, whose real name he did not know. The final papers were supposed to be drawn up tomorrow. All that was left was for this faceless savior to give the final nod. He excused himself to his study, a grand wood-paneled room that smelled of old leather and new fear. He needed to speak with his investment banker, to get some reassurance that the Nightfall deal was still on track. He poured himself a stiff brandy, his hand trembling slightly, and dialed the number. "Lawrence, it's Richard," he said, forcing a confident tone into his voice. "Just calling for a final status update on the Nightfall acquisition. Are we still set for tomorrow's announcement?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. It was a fraction of a second too long. "Richard," Lawrence began, his voice strained. "Something's happened. We received a new communiqué from Nightfall's legal team about an hour ago." Richard's blood ran cold. "What is it? Are they backing out?" "No," Lawrence said, and the word held no relief. "It's worse. They've withdrawn the friendly acquisition offer. They've just initiated a hostile takeover." The brandy glass slipped from Richard's fingers, shattering on the polished hardwood floor. "What? A hostile takeover? That's impossible. On what grounds?" "On the grounds that the company is critically undervalued and incompetently managed," Lawrence read, his voice flat and clinical. "They've launched a tender offered directly to the shareholders at 50 cents on the dollar. Richard, they're going to gut the company, and they're trying to take it for pennies." Richard couldn't breathe. This wasn't a savior, it was an assassin. Nightfall hadn't come to rescue them. They had come to bury them. The generosity, the patience, it had all been a lie, a predator playing with its food before the final, fatal bite. "Who are they?" Richard choked out, his voice a ragged whisper. "After all these months, who the hell is Nightfall?" "The filing just became public," Lawrence said, his voice grim. "It's a shell corporation, as we thought. But the beneficial owner has finally been revealed. It's one person. A woman." Richard leaned against his desk, the room beginning to spin. "A woman? Her name," Lawrence continued, "is Seraphina Hayes." The name meant nothing to Richard. It was just a name. "Seraphina Hayes?" he repeated, his mind frantically trying to place it. "Who is she?" "I've never heard of her." "She's a ghost, Richard. A corporate raider. Notoriously private, but apparently she's been at the top of this game for a decade," Lawrence explained. There's a photo here, attached to the filing. First one that's ever been made public, it looks like." An email notification pinged on Richard's computer. The subject line read, "Urgent, hostile takeover filing, Devington Textiles." With a trembling hand, he used his mouse to open the email. There was a link to a press release. He clicked it. The page loaded, and at the top, under the stark, bold headline, was a professional headshot. It was a picture of a black woman in her early 40s. A woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to stare right through the screen. A woman with an expression of cool, unshakable confidence. It was the woman from the auction. The woman his wife had publicly humiliated. The woman he had dismissed as new money. The woman who had bought his family's legacy out from under him for $2 million as an appetizer. The air left Richard's lungs in a single, silent scream. The predator had been in his house. He had looked her in the eye. He had laughed at her. He had handed her the very weapon she was now using to execute his entire world. The central, cosmic irony of it all crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. Their anonymous, faceless savior and their new, despised enemy were the same person. And they had just given her a deeply personal reason to ensure their destruction was not just financial, but total. Have you ever had a moment of sudden, horrifying realization where you understood you had made a catastrophic mistake? What did that moment feel like? Share your story in the comments. Richard Devington stared at the face on the screen, the face of Seraphina Hayes, and felt the last 30 years of his life crumble to ash. It wasn't just the loss of the company. It was the sheer, suffocating stupidity of it all. As the reality of his ruin settled in, the events of the evening replayed in his mind, no longer as a moment of triumph, but as a slow-motion, self-inflicted execution. The humiliation hadn't been a single insult. It had been a systematic, coordinated assault, a masterclass in the casual cruelty his family had perfected over generations. It began the moment the gavel fell. After Sera's winning bid of $2 million, the polite, hesitant applause was a signal for the Devingtons to begin their performance. It was Beatrice who led the charge, gliding toward Sera's table with the grace of a cobra, her husband and son trailing like loyal, venomous attendants. "My dear," Beatrice began, her voice a silken weapon, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear clearly. "One must admire the enthusiasm of new money. It's so wonderfully earnest. But you must understand, some things, history, legacy, blood, simply cannot be bought." The insult was as elegant as it was vicious. In a single sentence, she had framed Sera as an outsider, an uncultured social climber who understood the price of things but the value of nothing. It was a classic old money dismissal, designed to put Sera firmly in her place. Richard, playing his part, had let out a condescending chuckle. "Probably just a bit of excitement," he'd said, not even looking at Sera but addressing the other guests. "Don't worry. It'll wear off when you realize you have to pay for it." The implication was clear. A woman like her couldn't possibly have the funds to back up such a bid. He was publicly questioning her wealth, her very legitimacy. Then came Julian, the son, eager to prove his worth. He leaned in, a foul smirk on his face, and looked at the simple, elegant black gown Sera was wearing. "I must say," he drawled, his gaze raking over her with theatrical disdain, "it takes a certain kind of courage to show up to the Heritage Gala in something so basic. Did you get lost on your way to a cocktail lounge?" The surrounding guests tittered with laughter. The insult was twofold, an attack on her taste and a suggestion that she belonged in a lesser, more common establishment. It was a way of saying, "You are not one of us." But Beatrice wasn't finished. She despised being outshone, and her cruelty deepened. She noticed Sera hadn't touched her wine. "Oh, you must be parched after all that bidding," she cooed, picking up Sera's full glass. "But this is a 1982 Lafite. It's wasted on a palate that can't possibly appreciate it." With a flick of her wrist, she poured the deep, ruby-red liquid into a nearby floral arrangement, the wine bleeding into the pristine white petals. "Let me get you something more your speed," she said, signaling a waiter. "A glass of sweet rose, perhaps?" It was a breathtaking act of public shaming. She had treated Sera like a child, a person with unrefined tastes who couldn't be trusted with adult things. The message to the room was clear. This woman is not our equal. Throughout this onslaught, Sera remained preternaturally calm. She did not rise to the bait. She did not defend herself. She simply sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes watching them with a quiet, unnerving intensity. Her silence, her refusal to be provoked, seemed to infuriate Beatrice even more. "Don't you have anything to say for yourself?" Beatrice pressed, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Or did you spend all your words along with your money?" Sera finally spoke. "I have nothing to say to you, Mrs. Devington," she said, her voice even and low. This quiet, dignified refusal to engage was the final insult to Beatrice. She saw it as insolence. "You see," she announced to the room, her voice ringing with theatrical indignation. "This is the problem. They come into our world, take what they want, and show absolutely no respect for the institutions and the families that built it. No grace. No breeding." It was then that Richard delivered the final, devastating blow. He leaned down, his face close to Sera's, his voice a low, menacing whisper meant only for her. "Let me give you a piece of advice," he hissed, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and decay. "You may have won this little prize tonight, but you will never be welcome here. People like you are a novelty. You are a temporary amusement. But in the end, you will always be on the outside looking in. Remember that. People like you." The phrase hung in the air, a final poisoned dart. It was the culmination of everything. The dismissal of her wealth, the mockery of her clothes, the condescension about her taste, and the deep, unspoken racism and classism that underpinned it all. As they finally swept away from her table, victorious in their own minds, Sera watched them go. She saw the smug satisfaction on Beatrice's face, the weak smirk on Julian's, and the arrogant certainty in Richard's eyes. They believed they had won. They had put the upstart in her place and reinforced their own fragile superiority. They had no idea that their words were not just insults. They were a confession. In their attempt to humiliate her, they had revealed every single one of their weaknesses. Their arrogance, their blindness to the modern world, and their profound, pathetic insecurity. They had handed the predator a perfect, detailed map of their own jugular. And now, alone in his study with a shattered glass at his feet, Richard Devington finally, catastrophically, understood that the hunt was on. Why do you think people in positions of power sometimes feel the need to publicly humiliate others? Is it about maintaining dominance, or does it reveal a deep insecurity? Share your thoughts in the comments. Seraphina Hayes walked out of the Grand Heritage Ballroom and into the cold Boston night, her composure a flawless mask of ice. She betrayed nothing. Not a flicker of anger, not a hint of the humiliation that the Devingtons had so lavishly heaped upon her. She nodded graciously to the doorman, who held the door for her with a deference she had been denied all evening, and slipped into the back of her waiting town car. The door closed with a soft, expensive thud, sealing her inside a cocoon of silent, tinted glass. As the car pulled away from the curb, the glittering facade of the hotel receded in the rearview mirror, a monument to the arrogance and decay she was about to lay waste to. For a long moment, she just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, watching the city lights of Boston streak past in a blur of gold and white. The city was beautiful, indifferent, a river of light that flowed on, unaware of the silent, tectonic shift that had just occurred within her. The plan, until an hour ago, had been one of rescue, a friendly acquisition. She had seen the rot in Devington textiles, but she had also seen the legacy, the history, the thousands of mill workers and employees whose livelihoods depended on the company. Her initial strategy was surgical. Acquire the company with a generous offer, remove the incompetent leadership of Richard Devington, and inject the capital and innovation needed to save it. She had intended to be their hero, the silent partner who would restore the company to its former glory, a final, quiet tribute to the kind of business her father had believed in. It was to be an act of creation, not destruction. But as she sat in the silent luxury of the car, the Devingtons' words echoed in her mind, sharp and clear as splintered glass. A world she'll never belong to. The enthusiasm of new money. Did you get lost on your way to a cocktail lounge? People like you are a novelty. People like you. That was the phrase that landed and did not move. It was the same sentiment that had driven the men in suits who had padlocked her father's dream. It was the casual, unthinking cruelty of a class of people who believed they were the rightful arbiters of the world, who saw anyone outside their gilded cage not as a person, but as an object to be dismissed, mocked, or crushed. She closed her eyes. The mask of ice finally cracked, not with tears, but with a cold, terrifying clarity. The hero died. The friendly investor, the silent savior, that woman ceased to exist. In her place, a different entity began to stir, the one she kept locked away for special occasions. The predator. The ghost. The woman they called Nightfall. This was the precise moment the change occurred. It wasn't a snap of anger. It was a quiet, deliberate closing of a door. The part of her that had felt a flicker of sympathy for the legacy, for the history, went dark. The part of her that saw the Devingtons as incompetent but ultimately harmless fools was replaced by a part that saw them for what they were, a disease. And the only way to treat a disease is to cut it out, completely and without mercy. She remembered the look of smug satisfaction on Beatrice's face as she poured the expensive wine into the flowers. She remembered the weak, sycophantic laughter from Julian. She remembered the condescending poison in Richard's whisper. They hadn't just insulted her. They had, with their own actions, passed judgment on themselves. They had revealed that their legacy was not one of innovation or hard work, but of arrogance and exclusion. And a legacy like that, she decided in that moment, did not deserve to be saved. It deserved to be dismantled, sold for parts, and its memory erased from the earth. Her ambition to build something new was eclipsed by a far older, far more primal need, to avenge a past wrong. The Devingtons had unwittingly offered themselves up as proxies for the faceless corporation that had destroyed her father, and she was not going to let the opportunity go to waste. She opened her eyes. The woman reflected in the window was different. The observer was gone. The hunter was looking back. She reached for the burner phone, the one that connected her to the team that executed her will. Her fingers were steady, her movements precise. She dialed the number. The voice that answered on the first ring was all business. "Nightfall," the voice said. "Micah, it's me," Sera said. Her voice was a sliver of ice. "The Devington acquisition. The friendly offer we have on the table for market open. Finalized and ready to execute," Micah replied. "The wire transfers are staged. It's a clean rescue." Sera watched a bead of condensation trail down the car window like a single cold tear. "Scrap it," she said. There was a half-second of silence on the other end, the only acknowledgement of the stunning, multi-billion-dollar reversal. "Scrap it?" Micah asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Are we walking away?" "No," Sera said, and now her voice was dangerously quiet, the sound of a blade being unsheathed. "We are not walking away. We are changing the terms of engagement. Execute Protocol Chimera. At market open tomorrow." Protocol Chimera. It was the name for their most aggressive, most ruthless hostile takeover strategy. It was a corporate blitzkrieg, designed to shock, overwhelm, and shatter a company's defenses in a matter of hours. It involved leveraging debt, initiating proxy fights with shareholders, and a public tender offer so low it was a calculated insult. It was a declaration of war. "Understood," Micah said, the surprise in his voice now replaced by a cold, professional focus. "Are there any new parameters for the offer?" Sera's mind flashed back to Beatrice's sneering face, to the mocking laughter of the crowd. "Yes," she replied. "The offer is to be 50 cents on the dollar. I want to acquire a controlling interest by noon. And when we are done, I want the Devington family to have nothing. Not the company. Not their board seats. Not their name on the building. Nothing. It will be done," Micah said, and the line went dead. Sera placed the phone back down. It was done. The die was cast. The woman who had walked into the auction tonight, willing to be a savior, was gone. In her place was a cold and calculated villain, or a purveyor of justice, depending on your point of view. She had been publicly humiliated, and her response was not to cry or to rage, but to sign a death warrant for an entire corporate dynasty. The Devingtons thought they were playing a game of social chess. They were about to find out they had been in a cage with a tiger all along. Do you believe a single moment of humiliation can be enough to turn a hero into a villain? Or does it simply reveal the villain that was there all along? Share your thoughts in the comments. The Devington Textiles boardroom felt less like a center of power and more like a tomb. The long mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the pale, terrified faces of the men and women seated around it. This was the room where Richard Devington's grandfather had built an empire, and it was the room where Richard was about to watch it die. An emergency board meeting had been called at 8 a.m., and the air was thick with the metallic scent of fear. Richard stood at the head of the table, his hands trembling, his eyes bloodshot. He hadn't slept. The image of Seraphina Hayes' face on the hostile takeover filing had burned itself onto the back of his eyelids. Beatrice and Julian were not present. This was a place for business, and they were merely the beneficiaries of a world they didn't understand. A world that was now turning on them. The company's chief counsel, a grim-faced man named Arthur Vance, stood beside a projector, his expression funereal. "As you know," Arthur began, his voice low and strained, "at 7 a.m. this morning, a tender offer was made public. The entity known as Nightfall Acquisitions has initiated a hostile takeover of Devington Textiles." A wave of panicked murmurs went through the room. Their offer. Arthur continued, clicking to the next slide, is for $48 per share. The room erupted. $48? One board member shouted. That's an insult. Our stock closed at 95 yesterday. It's a lowball, a predator's offer, designed to trigger panic among the shareholders, Arthur confirmed, his face ashen. And it's working. In pre-market trading, they have already acquired an additional 1.2 million shares through a block trade with the Marston Fund. As of this moment, Nightfall controls approximately 34% of all outstanding shares. Richard felt the floor drop out from under him. 34%. They had been building a position in secret for months, and he had been completely blind to it. What are our defenses? Another board member asked, his voice shaking. The poison pill? Can we issue new stock to dilute their position? They've already filed an injunction to block any such defensive maneuvers, Arthur said, clicking to a slide filled with dense legal text. They're citing gross mismanagement and a breach of fiduciary duty to the shareholders, based on the company's Q3 losses of $78 million and a debt-to-equity ratio that is unsustainable. They claim Richard's leadership has actively suppressed shareholder value. Every word was a perfectly aimed dagger. They knew everything. They knew about the secret debts, the failed ventures, the catastrophic losses he had been hiding for years through creative accounting. My God, Richard whispered, slumping into his chair. They're not just trying to buy the company. They're trying to erase us. Who is this Seraphina Hayes? The board member demanded. Where did she come from? Before Arthur could answer, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Seraphina Hayes. She was not the woman from the auction. That woman was a quiet observer in an elegant gown. This woman was an executioner. She wore a slate-gray business dress, sharp as a shard of glass, and her hair was pulled back with severe precision. She was flanked by her legal counsel, a team of sharks in tailored suits. She strode into the room, her heels clicking on the marble floor with the rhythmic, terrifying finality of a death knell. Who are you? One of the board members stammered, half rising from his chair. This is a private meeting. Sera didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on Richard Devington, a cold, predatory gaze that stripped him bare. On the contrary, she said, her voice filling the silent room. As the single largest shareholder of Devington Textiles as of 8:15 a.m. this morning, I believe this meeting is precisely my business. The realization washed over the board members' faces like a wave of ice water. This was her. This was Seraphina Hayes. This was Nightfall. Richard struggled to his feet, his face a mask of pleading desperation. Miss Hayes, Seraphina, last night was a terrible misunderstanding. My wife, she was honest, Sera cut him off, her voice devoid of any emotion. Your wife, your son, and you, Mr. Devington, were all refreshingly honest. You showed me exactly who you are when you believe someone has no power over you. Consider this my response. She walked to the head of the table, placing her leather briefcase on its polished surface with a soft, definitive thud. She was taking his seat. Last night, she said, addressing the entire, horrified room, was meant to be the final step in a friendly acquisition. My offer was $110 per share. A generous offer that would have saved this company, preserved your jobs, and allowed the Devington family to exit with their dignity and a considerable fortune intact. She paused, letting the weight of the lost opportunity crush them. Instead, the Devingtons chose to provide me with a different kind of education. I was taught that in their world, I did not belong. I was taught that my worth was less than the wine they served. I was taught, she said, her eyes boring into Richard's, that people like me are a novelty, a temporary amusement. She gestured to her legal team, who began distributing thick documents to the stunned board members. So, I have amended my offer. This is no longer an acquisition. It is a liquidation. The new offer of $48 per share is final. My team is currently in contact with every major shareholder. We anticipate having a controlling interest of 51% by noon today, at which point the entire board will be dissolved and the Devington family's involvement with this company, in any capacity, will be permanently terminated. Julian Devington, who had followed his father to the meeting, finally found his voice. You can't do this, he whimpered, his face pale. This is our family's company. Sera turned her cold gaze on him for the first time. Your family had a company, she corrected him. You had a legacy, and you traded it all for a few moments of cheap laughter at my expense. I hope it was worth it. She then turned back to Richard. You were right about one thing, Mr. Devington. I did have to pay for the painting. $2 million. I consider it the down payment on your entire world. With that, she took the seat at the head of the table. The king was dead. The queen had taken the throne. In a high-stakes confrontation, what is more powerful? A loud, emotional outburst or a cold, quiet declaration of facts? Share your opinion and why you think so in the comments. The moment Seraphina Hayes took the seat at the head of the table, the world accelerated. For the Devingtons, time seemed to grind to a halt, trapping them in a frozen tableau of horror. But for Sera's team, the clock had just started. What followed was not a battle. It was a corporate blitzkrieg, a perfectly executed symphony of destruction that unfolded with breathtaking speed. The scene fractures, cutting between three key locations. The cold tomb of the Devington boardroom, a high-tech war room, where Sera's team operated, and the frantic trading floors of Wall Street. Scene start. Devington boardroom. 9:05 a.m. Richard Devington, his face the color of ash, is on his phone, his voice a desperate, cracking whisper. Charles, you have to help me. The Sterling Fund has to stand with us. We've been friends for 30 years. He listens, his face crumbling. What do you mean you're evaluating the offer? It's a predator's offer. Charles. He pulls the phone away from his ear, staring at the dead line. His oldest ally had just abandoned him. Across the table, Sera sits perfectly still, observing his panic with the detached calm of a biologist watching a specimen squirm. She doesn't gloat. She just watches. Nightfall War Room, 9:06 a.m. Micah, Sera's second-in-command, stands before a wall of monitors, a headset on, his voice sharp and precise. The Sterling Fund has folded. They're abstaining. That frees up another 7%. Move on to the pension funds. Emphasize the mismanagement data from Q3. I want every fund manager who Devington has ever snubbed at a cocktail party to know that today is the day they get their revenge. Analysts furiously type. Their screens a waterfall of stock tickers and legal documents. The room is a quiet, intense hive of activity. Wall Street. 9:30 a.m. Market open. A montage of shots. The opening bell rings. On the trading floor, the ticker for Devington Textiles, symbol DVT, is immediately engulfed in a sea of red. Sell orders cascade across the screen. Financial news anchors appear, their faces a mix of shock and excitement. Breaking news in the textile sector. A stunning hostile takeover bid has been launched against the century-old Devington Textiles by a mysterious entity known as Nightfall Acquisitions. Devington boardroom, 10 a.m. Arthur Vance, the lawyer, is sweating, his tie loosened. They've filed a Schedule 13D with the SEC. They're legally required to disclose their intentions, and they've done so. They've declared their intent to replace the entire board and liquidate mismanaged assets. Richard, they're not just buying the company, they're telling the world they're here to clean house. Julian Devington, who has been frantically Googling Seraphina Hayes, looks up from his phone, his face pale. Dad, she's done this a dozen times. They call her the Undertaker. She took down 3 legacy companies last year alone. They never saw it coming. Nightfall War Room, 10:15 a.m. Micah is on a conference call with a powerful shareholder. That's correct, Mr. Henderson. We project that under new management, we can increase shareholder value by 40% within 18 months by streamlining production and expanding into global markets the current board has arrogantly ignored. Yes, your 4% stake would be very welcome on our side of the ledger. We appreciate your foresight. He hangs up and makes a mark on a whiteboard. A triumphant smile touches his lips. Henderson is with us. We're at 42%. Devington boardroom, 11:30 a.m. The Devingtons and their board are powerless. They are watching their empire be dismantled in real time on the financial news network playing on the large screen in the boardroom. Every ally they call folds. Every defensive strategy their lawyers propose is already countered by an injunction Sera's team had filed hours ago. They are trapped. Sera had not just planned an attack, she had planned a funeral. She had spent months studying their weaknesses, their debts, their arrogant refusal to innovate. She knew where every single corporate bone was buried, and now she was digging them all up for the world to see. The final blow comes just before noon. Arthur Vance's phone buzzes. He looks at it, and the last bit of color drains from his face. It's over, he says, his voice a hollow echo in the silent room. The Teachers' Pension Fund and 2 other institutional investors have just accepted the tender offer. They've crossed the 51% threshold. She has a controlling interest. Richard Devington doesn't rage. He doesn't scream. He simply slumps in his chair, a broken king in a conquered castle. Sera stands up. She hasn't spoken a word for nearly 3 hours. She smooths down her dress and picks up her briefcase. "Gentlemen," she says, her voice cutting through the despair. "Thank you for your service to this company. It is no longer required." She turns and walks toward the door, her legal team falling into formation behind her. At the threshold, she pauses and looks back at Richard one last time. "My team will be in touch regarding the liquidation of your family's remaining assets," she says, her voice holding no malice, only the cold, hard finality of a business transaction. "Enjoy the painting." Then she is gone. The door clicks shut, leaving the Devingtons alone in the tomb of their own making, the silence of the room a deafening monument to their failure. When it comes to winning a major conflict, what do you believe is more important, having overwhelming power or having a flawless strategy? Share your thoughts in the comments. 2 weeks later, the Devington Textiles boardroom was the same room, but it was a different world. The air, once thick with panic and despair, was now charged with the quiet, efficient energy of a new regime. The old, fusty portraits of past Devington patriarchs had been removed from the walls, leaving behind pale, ghostly rectangles. The only decoration now was a single, stunning landscape painting, the one Seraphina Hayes had bought at the auction, hanging directly behind the chairperson's seat. Seraphina sat at the head of the long mahogany table, not as a guest or an invader, but as the newly ratified chairperson and majority shareholder. She presided over the meeting with a calm, unshakable authority. The old board was gone, replaced by her own hand-picked team of sharp, mercilessly efficient experts. The only remnants of the old world were 3 ghosts sitting at the far end of the table: Richard, Beatrice, and Julian Devington. They were there by legal necessity, required to be present for their formal removal. They were utterly broken. Richard's face was a gray, collapsed mask of a man. Beatrice, stripped of her jewels and her arrogance, sat shrunken and silent, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant. Julian just stared at his hands, a man-child finally facing a consequence he couldn't comprehend. Sera did not look at them. She addressed the meeting, her voice crisp and professional. Item 4 on the agenda: the dissolution of the previous executive committee and the formal removal of all non-essential personnel. Mr. Vance, please read the resolution. Her lawyer, Arthur Vance, who had wisely and immediately switched his allegiance to the new power, stood and read from a document in a flat, legal monotone. Be it resolved that pursuant to the acquisition by Nightfall Holdings, the board positions held by Richard Devington, Beatrice Devington, and Julian Devington are hereby terminated, effective immediately. All corporate privileges, including salaries, stock options, and expense accounts, are revoked as of this moment. He placed the document on the table. "All in favor?" Sera asked, her voice echoing in the silent room. A chorus of ayes came from her new board. Opposed? The 3 Devingtons sat in stunned, pathetic silence. "The motion carries," Sera declared, her voice as final as a judge's gavel. She then looked at the Devingtons directly for the first time, her expression not one of triumph, but of simple, transactional finality. "Richard, Beatrice, Julian," she said, using their first names as a final stripping of their formal titles. "A security detail is waiting outside to escort you from the premises. You will be allowed to collect your personal effects under their supervision. Your corporate credit cards have been deactivated. The keys to your company cars will be collected at the door." Beatrice finally found her voice, a weak, reedy whisper. "But where are we supposed to go?" "The house." "The Beacon Hill mansion," Sera clarified, as if speaking to a child, "is a corporate asset. It is now the property of this company. You will be given 24 hours to vacate." This was the final, devastating blow. Not just the company, but their home. The ancestral mansion where Beatrice had hosted her cruel society parties, the place she had believed was her birthright, was being taken from them. She let out a small, wounded sound, like an animal. "You are a monster," Julian spat, his face flushing with a pathetic, impotent rage. Sera's gaze flickered to him, cold and dismissive. "No, Julian. I am a businesswoman. Your family taught me a valuable lesson at the auction. In your world, there are the powerful and the powerless. I simply learned the lesson better than you did. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a company to rebuild." She turned away from them, her attention already on the next item of business, a presentation on a new global logistics strategy. She had rendered them so insignificant that their very presence was no longer worthy of her attention. They were a historical footnote, a piece of old business that had been concluded. The security guards entered, two large, impassive men. They stood behind the Devingtons' chairs. The humiliation was absolute. The family that had once ruled this building was now being escorted out of it like common trespassers. As Richard was led past the head of the table, he stopped for a moment, his eyes pleading with Sera. "My grandfather," he rasped, gesturing to a pale rectangle on the wall where a grand portrait had once hung. "He built this company with his bare hands." "Your grandfather built a company," Sera replied without looking up from her papers. "You turned it into a museum. And then you let it crumble. I am not destroying his legacy, Richard. I am saving it from you." The guards led them out. The heavy boardroom doors clicked shut, sealing them out of their own world forever. The new board didn't pause. The meeting continued, the discussion of profit margins and supply chains flowing on, utterly indifferent to the dynasty that had just been extinguished. The House of Devington was not just sold, it was erased. The name, once a symbol of Boston's elite, was now a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms, a lesson in the high price of arrogance. Seraphina Hayes had not just bought their company. She had bought their past, their present, and their future. And as she sat in Richard Devington's chair, under the gaze of the beautiful painting she had won, she had finally, completely, avenged the ghost of a 16-year-old girl who had once watched a man in a suit put a padlock on her father's dream. Do you think Seraphina's actions were an act of justice or an act of pure revenge? Is there a difference? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. 6 months after the fall of the House of Devington, the main factory floor of the newly christened Hayes Legacy Textiles was almost unrecognizable. The air, once thick with the dust of decay and the scent of obsolescence, now hummed with the clean, vibrant energy of rebirth. The old, clanking looms that Richard Devington had refused to replace had been retired to a museum. In their place, state-of-the-art, high-efficiency machines moved with a quiet, powerful rhythm, weaving the future of a company that had been pulled back from the brink of extinction. Seraphina Hayes walked the floor, not in a power suit, but in jeans and a simple blouse, her sleeves rolled up. She moved with a familiar ease among the whirring machinery, a smile on her face. The corporate raider, the woman they called the Undertaker, was gone. In her place was a builder, a creator. True to her nature, her takeover had been a surgical strike. But after the cancerous leadership was removed, her strategy had shifted from demolition to reconstruction. She had not, as the financial world predicted, stripped the company for parts. Instead, she had invested heavily. She had retrained every single employee, implemented new, sustainable technologies, and secured new global contracts that Richard Devington, in his arrogance, had deemed beneath him. She hadn't just saved Devington Textiles. She had made it stronger, more innovative, and more profitable than it had been in 50 years. The company was alive again, and the thousands of workers whose jobs she had secured looked at her not with fear, but with a fierce, protective loyalty. Today was a special day. She had called a company-wide assembly, not in a stuffy boardroom, but right here on the factory floor, among the people who were the true heart of the enterprise. A simple stage and a microphone had been set up. As she stepped up to speak, a respectful silence fell over the bustling floor. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice warm and resonant. 6 months ago, we began a difficult but necessary journey together. You were told that a hostile predator had taken over, that your futures were in jeopardy. Today, I want to talk about a different kind of future. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the workers, the men and women who, like her own father, dedicated their lives to a craft. This company was built on a foundation of quality and hard work, a foundation that had been neglected for far too long. Together, we have restored that foundation. But a company is more than just profit margins and stock prices. It must have a soul. It must have a purpose beyond its own survival. She took a breath, her professional composure softening into something deeply personal. "Many years ago," she said, her voice now softer, "my father owned a small business. He was a master tailor, a craftsman who poured his entire soul into his work. But his business was crushed by a larger corporation that saw him not as a competitor, but as an inconvenience to be erased. He lost everything, and our family learned a painful lesson, that in the world of business, the powerful too often prey on the passionate." A new, profound understanding settled over the crowd. This wasn't just a business for her. This was a mission. I have spent my career operating in that world, she continued. I learned its rules. I learned how to fight and how to win. But I never forgot that first, painful lesson. And I believe that the purpose of winning, the purpose of gaining power, is not to accumulate more for yourself, but to build a shield for those who have none. With that, she gestured to a large screen behind her. A new logo appeared. Today, I am proud to announce the formation of the Marcus Hayes Foundation, she said, her voice thick with emotion as she spoke her father's name. Funded by a significant portion of this company's profits, the foundation has one simple mission: to protect and invest in small, family-owned businesses that are threatened by predatory corporate practices. We will provide legal aid, financial grants, and strategic mentorship. We will be the shield my father never had. The factory floor, which had been silent, erupted in a thunderous, heartfelt applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It was an applause not just for the announcement, but for the woman who stood before them. A woman who had taken her own pain and transformed it into a source of hope for countless others. Seraphina smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. The ghost of the 16-year-old girl watching a padlock go on her father's dream was finally at peace. She had not just avenged him, she had honored him in the most powerful way imaginable. She had turned their family's greatest tragedy into a legacy of creation and protection. The loom of Devington Textiles was weaving a new future, and its threads were no longer just cotton and wool, but justice, resilience, and hope. This story is a powerful reminder that we all have the capacity to turn our deepest wounds into our greatest strengths. What is a challenge you've faced in your life that has ultimately made you stronger or more determined to help others? Share your story of resilience in the comments below. If you believe stories of justice, resilience, and empowerment need to be told, help us share them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales you won't want to miss.